Thomas Blake fixed his black robes in his office. The clock showed 9 in the morning. At 42, he was the youngest judge in town. His hands smoothed down the front of his robe one last time before he entered his courtroom. "All rise for Judge Blake," the bailiff called. The people in the courtroom stood up. Thomas walked to his seat with a straight back. He nodded once, and everyone sat down again. "First case," he said in his deep voice. Thomas was known for being strict but fair. Some lawyers called him firm hand because he never bent the rules. He had worked hard to get where he was. His old teacher, Judge William Foster, had helped him along the way. "We have 20 cases today, Your Honor," said the clerk, handing him a stack of papers. Thomas nodded. Most days were the same. Traffic tickets, small arguments between neighbors, and shoplifting cases. He handled them all the same way, by following the rules exactly. "Let's begin," he said. The morning moved quickly. Thomas gave fines to people who ran red lights. He ordered a man to pay for a fence he had damaged. He told 2 arguing neighbors to stay away from each other. By lunchtime, his voice was getting tired. "Next case," he called out. A tall black woman with gray hair walked to the front of the room. She wore a neat blue dress and carried a small handbag. Thomas noticed she had kind eyes but looked worried. "Dorothy Wilson," read the clerk. "Charged with parking in a handicapped space without proper permit." Thomas looked at the paper in front of him. The fine was usually £250 for this offense. He looked up at the woman. "Mrs. Wilson, how do you plead?" he asked. Dorothy stood straight. "Guilty with an explanation, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. Thomas raised his eyebrows slightly. Most people just said guilty or not guilty. They didn't ask to explain. "You may explain, but the law is clear on this matter," he said. Dorothy took a deep breath. "My husband has very bad arthritis, Judge. He had a doctor's appointment yesterday. We have a handicapped permit, but we left it at home by mistake. He was in so much pain that morning." She paused, then continued. "I know I broke the rule. But my husband couldn't walk far, and I had to get him to the doctor. I'm sorry." Thomas watched her face. She seemed honest and sorry about what she had done. For a moment, he thought about reducing the fine. But then he remembered what Judge Foster had taught him: the law must be the same for everyone. If you make exceptions, where do you stop? Thomas cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wilson, I understand your situation. However, those spaces are reserved for people who have their permits with them. The rule exists to make sure the spaces are available for those who need them." He tapped his pen on the desk. "The fine is £250. A small flash of disappointment crossed Dorothy's face, but she nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." "You can pay at the clerk's office," Thomas said, already looking at the next case file. Dorothy turned to leave. As she walked away, Thomas felt something strange, a small doubt. Had he been too harsh? But he pushed the feeling away. Rules were rules. After court ended at 5 o'clock, Thomas remembered he had promised to visit his old mentor. Judge William Foster had retired 3 years ago but still liked to hear about court cases. Thomas had dinner with him once a month. Thomas changed out of his robes, put on his coat, and drove across town to William's house. It was a pretty brick home with flowers in the front garden. He knocked on the door, thinking about what he would tell William about today's cases. The door opened, and William stood there with a big smile. "Thomas. Right on time as always. Come in, come in. Dorothy's just making tea." Thomas smiled as he stepped inside. He was looking forward to a quiet evening with his mentor. As he walked into the living room, he was already forgetting about the woman he had fined earlier that day. Thomas stepped into the warm living room. The smell of fresh tea filled the air. William Foster's house always felt like home to him. There were books on the shelves and a fire in the fireplace. "Sit down, my boy," William said, pointing to the comfortable armchair. "Tell me about your day in court." Before Thomas could answer, he heard footsteps coming from the kitchen. A woman walked in carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. Thomas looked up and froze. It was her, the woman he had found that morning. Dorothy Wilson stood in the doorway, the tea tray in her hands. Her eyes widened when she saw Thomas. "Judge Blake," she said softly. Thomas stood up quickly. "Mrs. Wilson." William looked between them, confused. "You two know each other?" Dorothy placed the tray carefully on the coffee table. Her hands shook slightly. "We met in court today," she said. "Dorothy is my wife," William said with a smile. "We got married last year. I thought I told you." Thomas felt his face grow hot. He remembered William mentioning a new wife, but he had never met her until now. And he had never known her name. I didn't realize," Thomas stammered. "Please, sit down," Dorothy said. She poured tea into 3 cups, her movements calm and steady. But Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. Thomas sat down slowly. This was the woman he had shown no mercy to just hours ago. And she was his mentor's wife. William took a biscuit. "So what brings my Dorothy to your courtroom?" Thomas couldn't speak. His mouth felt dry. Dorothy answered for him. "I parked in a handicapped space without our permit. We left it at home by mistake." "Ah," William nodded. "When you took me to Dr. Phillips yesterday." He turned to Thomas. "My arthritis has been very bad lately. Some days I can hardly walk." Thomas felt worse with each word. He remembered Dorothy's explanation in court, her husband's pain, the forgotten permit. "Judge Blake gave me a fair fine," Dorothy said. £250. William raised his eyebrows. "The full amount? That's quite steep." Thomas felt sweat on his forehead. "I was just following the law," he said weakly. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Thomas stared at his teacup, unable to look at either of them. "Well," William finally said, "rules are rules, I suppose." Dorothy touched her husband's hand. "It's fine, dear. I did break the rule." Thomas watched them. William looked at his wife with such love in his eyes. Dorothy's kindness to her husband was clear in every small gesture. "How did you two meet?" Thomas asked, trying to change the subject. William's face brightened. "Dorothy was a teacher at the community center where I volunteered after retiring. She taught English to newcomers. I joined to help with legal matters, but mostly I just wanted to talk to her." Dorothy smiled. "He asked me the same question 5 times on our first meeting. I think he was too nervous to listen to my answers." They all laughed, and some of the tension left the room. As they talked, Thomas learned more about Dorothy. She had taught for 30 years. She worked with poor families. She volunteered at the hospital. She was wise and kind, just like William. When William excused himself to take his evening medicine, Thomas and Dorothy were left alone. The silence felt heavy. "Mrs. Foster," Thomas began, using her married name, "I want to apologize." Dorothy shook her head. "For what? Following the law? That's your job. But I didn't really listen to you. I didn't try to understand." Dorothy looked at him with those kind eyes. "You couldn't have known who I was." "That's just it," Thomas said. "It shouldn't matter who you are. Everyone deserves to be heard." Dorothy studied his face. "William always said you were his best student. He said you cared about justice more than anyone he knew." Thomas felt shame wash over him. "I'm not sure if that's true anymore." "Justice isn't just about rules," Dorothy said softly. "It's about understanding people." William returned to the room, and they moved on to other topics. They talked about books and politics and old court cases. But Thomas couldn't stop thinking about what Dorothy had said. When it was time to leave, Thomas shook William's hand. Then he turned to Dorothy. "It was an honor to meet you properly, Mrs. Foster," he said. Dorothy smiled. Please, call me Dorothy. As Thomas drove home, he thought about his day. He had been so sure of himself in court. Now he wasn't sure of anything. What did it mean to be a good judge? Was following the rules enough? He didn't have answers yet. But for the first time in years, he was asking the questions. Thomas didn't sleep well that night. He kept seeing Dorothy's face in court and then again at William's house. The next morning, he arrived at the courthouse early. He went straight to the clerk's office. "Has Mrs. Dorothy Wilson paid her fine yet?" he asked. The clerk checked the computer. "No, Judge Blake. She has 30 days to pay." Thomas nodded and took out his wallet. He counted out £250 in cash. "I'm paying it for her," he said. The clerk looked surprised but took the money. "Should I tell her it's been paid?" "Yes, but don't say who paid it." Thomas walked to his courtroom feeling a little better. But he knew paying the fine wasn't enough. Something deeper had to change. That day in court, Thomas listened more carefully to each person. A young man had been speeding because his wife was having a baby. An old woman had forgotten to renew her dog license. Each case was more than just breaking a rule. Each was a human story. At the end of the day, Thomas called William. "I was wondering if I could come by again," Thomas said. "I'd like to talk more with you and Dorothy." William sounded pleased. "Of course. Come for dinner tomorrow." The next evening, Thomas brought flowers for Dorothy and a bottle of wine for William. Dorothy seemed surprised by the flowers. "Thank you, Judge Blake," she said. "Please, call me Thomas," he replied. During dinner, Thomas asked Dorothy about her teaching work. She told stories about her students, people from all over the world who came to learn English. "Everyone has a story," she said. "Sometimes they just need someone to listen." After dinner, William went to his study to find a book he wanted to show Thomas. Dorothy and Thomas sat in the living room alone. "I paid your fine," Thomas said quietly. Dorothy's eyes widened. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to. But that's not enough. I've been thinking about what you said about justice and understanding." Dorothy leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" "I want to start a new program at the courthouse. For small crimes, people could do community service instead of paying fines. Many people can't afford the fines anyway." Dorothy's face lit up. "That's a wonderful idea. Would you help me?" Thomas asked. "You know the community better than I do." "I'd be honored," Dorothy said. When William returned, they shared the idea with him. The old judge's eyes filled with tears. "This is why I became a judge," he said. "To help people, not just punish them." Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Dorothy worked together on the new program. They visited community centers, schools, and hospitals to find places where people could do service work. One day, they sat in Thomas's office going over paperwork. Dorothy looked up suddenly. "Why did you decide to become a judge?" she asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "When I was young, my father lost his job. He got caught stealing food for our family. The judge was harsh and gave him jail time. That left us with nothing. I thought if I became a judge, I could be different." Dorothy reached across the desk and touched his hand. "You are different, Thomas. You're learning and growing." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "I forgot why I started. I got caught up in the rules." "It happens to all of us," Dorothy said gently. "The important thing is that you remembered." On the day the new community service program launched, the courthouse was packed. William came to see the first case under the new rules. A woman had been caught stealing medicine for her sick child. "Mrs. Brown," Thomas said, "under the new program, you can do 20 hours of community service instead of paying a fine or going to jail. Would you accept this option?" The woman's face showed relief. "Yes, Your Honor." "Thank you." Later, reporters asked Thomas about the program. "It's about remembering that justice should help people, not just punish them," he said. I was reminded of this by two very wise teachers. He looked over at William and Dorothy, who stood nearby. That evening, the three of them celebrated at William and Dorothy's house. They sat in the garden, drinking tea as the sun set. You know, William said to Thomas, when I first met you, I saw something special. You had both a sharp mind and a good heart. Sometimes the mind gets ahead of the heart, but they work best together. Thomas smiled. I have good teachers. Dorothy patted his hand. And we have a good student. As Thomas drove home that night, he felt more at peace than he had in years. He had found his purpose again, not just to follow the law, but to use it to help people. And he had found two people who would guide him on that path. 6 months passed. Thomas's community service program was working well. Over 100 people had chosen to help in the community instead of paying fines they couldn't afford. The local newspaper wrote a story about the program, calling it Justice with Heart. Thomas and Dorothy met every week to talk about the program. Sometimes they met at her house, sometimes at his office. William often joined them, but his arthritis was getting worse. Some days he couldn't leave his bed. One rainy Tuesday, Dorothy missed their meeting. Thomas waited in his office for an hour, but she didn't come. This wasn't like her. She was always on time. He called her house. No answer. He tried William's cell phone. Hello? William's voice sounded tired and stressed. William, it's Thomas. Is everything okay? Dorothy missed our meeting. There was a pause. We're at the hospital. Dorothy had a fall this morning. She hit her head. Thomas felt his heart drop. Which hospital? I'll come right now. City General. Room 307. Thomas drove to the hospital as fast as he safely could. He found William sitting beside Dorothy's bed. She was asleep, with a bandage on her head. What happened? Thomas asked quietly. William looked up with sad eyes. She was helping me to the bathroom. I lost my balance and grabbed her for support. We both fell. I'm fine, but she hit her head on the corner of the sink. Thomas put his hand on William's shoulder. It's not your fault. Of course it is, William said. I'm too proud to use a walker. And now look what happened. The doctor came in and checked Dorothy's vital signs. The scan shows a small brain bleed. We're watching it closely. She should wake up soon. Thomas and William sat together for hours. They talked about Dorothy, about the past, about their work. William told Thomas how much Dorothy had come to care for him. She says you remind her of our son, William said. Thomas was surprised. I didn't know you had a son. William's eyes filled with tears. James died 10 years ago. Car accident. Dorothy was his mother from her first marriage. When we met, I think we both needed someone to fill that empty space. Thomas felt his own eyes grow wet. He had never known this part of their story. At midnight, Dorothy finally woke up. She looked confused at first, then saw William and Thomas. What are you two doing here? She asked weakly. Waiting for you to wake up and tell us what to do, Thomas said with a smile. Dorothy tried to sit up but winced in pain. I have a terrible headache. The doctor came back and checked her again. The bleed has stopped. That's good news. But Mrs. Foster, you'll need help at home for a while. No driving, no lifting, no stress. After the doctor left, William looked worried. I can't take care of you. I can barely take care of myself. We'll hire a nurse, Dorothy said. We can't afford that, William replied. Not for long. Thomas spoke up. I have a spare bedroom. You could both stay with me until Dorothy recovers. They both looked at him in surprise. We couldn't impose like that, Dorothy said. It's not an imposition, Thomas insisted. You've both done so much for me. Let me help you now. 3 days later, Thomas helped move Dorothy and William into his house. He had a bedroom on the first floor, so neither of them would have to climb stairs. He hired a part-time nurse to come during the day when he was at work. Living together wasn't always easy. William was grumpy in the mornings. Dorothy worried about everything. Thomas had been alone for a long time and was used to his own space. But there were good moments too. They ate dinner together every night. They watched old movies. They talked about books and cases in life. One evening, Thomas came home to find Dorothy cooking in his kitchen. She wasn't supposed to be out of bed yet. "What are you doing?" he asked. "You should be resting." Dorothy smiled. "I'm making my special lasagna. It's a thank you for everything you've done." Thomas started to argue but stopped. He understood her need to give back, to not just be the one receiving help. "At least let me help," he said, putting on an apron. As they cooked together, Dorothy told him stories about her son James. How he loved baseball. How he wanted to be a judge like his stepfather. "He would have liked you," she said to Thomas. That night, as they ate dinner, William raised his glass. "To family," he said. "Not the one we're born with, but the one we find." Thomas felt something warm in his chest. He had been alone for so long. Now his house was full of life and love. "To family," he echoed, and they all clinked glasses. 5 years passed. So much had changed. William had died peacefully in his sleep 2 years ago. Dorothy still lived in Thomas's house. They had become like mother and son. The community service program was now used in courts across the country. Thomas had been asked to speak about it at law schools and judge conferences. Each time, he told the story of how it began with a parking ticket and his mentor's wife. One cold winter morning, Thomas got a special letter. He opened it at the breakfast table. Dorothy was across from him, reading the newspaper. "I don't believe it," he whispered. Dorothy looked up. "What is it?" "I've been nominated for the High Court." The High Court was the highest court in the land. Only the best judges were chosen. Dorothy jumped up and hugged him. William would be so proud. Thomas held the letter with shaking hands. "There will be interviews and votes." "It might not happen." "It will," Dorothy said firmly. "You're the best judge I know." The next few months were busy. Thomas had many interviews. People from his past were asked about him. His cases were reviewed. One day, a woman came to his office. Thomas recognized her as Mrs. Brown, the first person who had done community service instead of paying a fine. "Judge Blake," she said, "I heard you might become a high court judge. I wanted to thank you for what you did for me 5 years ago." Thomas shook her hand. "How are you doing now?" "Very well. My son is healthy." And the community service led to a real job at the hospital. "I'm a nurse's aide now." Thomas smiled. "That's wonderful news." "They're asking people about you," Mrs. Brown said. "I told them you changed my life." The day of the final vote arrived. Thomas and Dorothy sat in his living room, watching the news on TV. The vote would be announced live. "I'm so nervous," Thomas admitted. Dorothy patted his hand. "Whatever happens, you've done good work." The news anchor appeared on screen. "We're waiting for the result of today's vote for the new High Court judge. The two candidates are Judge Thomas Blake and Judge Henry Powell." Thomas couldn't watch. He got up and walked to the window. "And now we have the result," the anchor said. "By a vote of 8-3, the new High Court judge will be Thomas Blake." Dorothy screamed with joy. Thomas turned from the window, his eyes wide with shock. "You did it!" Dorothy cried, hugging him tight. The phone started ringing. Friends and colleagues were calling to congratulate him. Thomas could hardly believe it was real. That night, after all the calls and excitement, Thomas and Dorothy sat quietly by the fireplace. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, "about what to say in my acceptance speech. I want to talk about you and William." Dorothy smiled. "That would be nice. Not just nice. Important. People need to know where this all began. With a parking ticket and a lesson about real justice. 2 weeks later, Thomas stood at a podium. His new black high court robes felt heavy on his shoulders. Dorothy sat in the front row, wearing her best blue dress. "I stand before you today honored and humbled," Thomas began. "But I didn't get here alone. My journey changed 5 years ago when I fined a woman for parking in a handicapped space." He told the whole story, how he learned the woman was his mentor's wife, how she taught him that justice needed both rules and understanding, how they created the community service program together. "Dorothy Foster showed me that behind every case is a human being with a story," he said. "William Foster taught me the law. But Dorothy taught me about justice." People clapped. Some had tears in their eyes. "As a high court judge, I will remember these lessons. I will apply the law fairly. But I will never forget the people behind the cases." After the ceremony, many people came to congratulate Thomas. Important judges and politicians shook his hand. But he kept looking for Dorothy. He found her talking with a young judge who had worked with them on the community service program. "There you are," Thomas said. "Ready to go home?" Dorothy smiled at him. "I'm so proud of you," she said quietly. As they drove home, Thomas thought about his journey. From the strict judge who fined an old woman without really listening, to a high court judge who would help shape the country's laws. "What are you thinking about?" Dorothy asked. "How different my life would be if you hadn't parked in that handicapped space." They both laughed. "Everything happens for a reason," Dorothy said. "Even parking tickets." That night, Thomas looked at an old picture of William on the mantel. "We did it," he whispered to his mentor's image. "And I'll make you proud." As he turned off the lights, Thomas felt at peace. He had found his true purpose as a judge. And more importantly, he had found a family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he would face them with both his sharp mind and his good heart, just as William and Dorothy had taught him.